Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sprint 206 review. This is a normal 2-week sprint, and let's get started. I'll start with the overview, Melody on the UI, Adam on providers, Joe on the platform, Keenan on the API, and then Adam and myself will give a short demo of the workflows POC that we've been working on. This sprint, there were a lot of PRs merged this sprint. I looked into it, and we cut the Petrosian branch this sprint. And part of the process in that is, one, creating all the branches, which is a lot of commits, but also then changing those to, for example, limit the which Ruby is running on those branches. So there were a lot of blast out scripts that were run this week, and that's why the numbers are so high. And you can see it on the closed PRs by label, where we have a lot of test type issues that were fixed. And over to Melody on the UI.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So on the UI side, we had 19 PRs merged into ManageIQ UI Classic, 7 bug fixes, 7 enhancements, and 5 miscellaneous PRs, as well as 4 PRs merged into the ManageIQ Decorators repo, 2 enhancements, and 2 dependencies, for a total of 23 PRs merged into the UI. Next slide. So for this PR, David worked on the service request page. Now it can display log information in a simple Carbon chart. For the React timeline, I continued its conversion to React, and additionally, this PR also had a subsequent PR to remove the PF3/timeline package, which contained a lot of old things that we were really grateful to be able to get rid of. In this PR, Akil converted the schedule edit page to React. Here, Jeffrey fixed some accessibility violations in our service page. And in the next slide, we can see that he also did similar changes in the policies page. The AutoSDE team added a dedicated UI for listing, detailing, creating, and deleting storage services. They also, in the decorators repo, added the custom decorator for the storage services, which you can see in the screenshots there. Jeffrey fixed a bug where you would see previously selected items in the compare page, and now we can see only the currently selected items. The AutoSDE team also fixed a series of bugs in the volume create page related to the add button and the multi-select fields. They also added validation to the volume name check, as well as enhance the storage resource summary page. Jeffrey also fixed a bug where the widget menu disappeared off screen if there was no space to render it, and now it's smart enough to render above where there is space. There was a bug in the service page that would allow you to remove services even if there were none on the page, and so Jeffrey fixed this as well. And he also converted the settings zones list table to use React. And the AutoSDE team added a decorator to the host initiator group and adjusted the decorator for volume mapping to its new icon. Moving on to our miscellaneous PR, Keenan made a performance improvement to use an SQL count that will cut the query down so that it only brings back the IDs. And David made a modification to the way request logs are passed into the React data tables so that it would make the output easier to understand at a glance. Akil also removed the monitor menu from our sidebar as the latest OpenStack update no longer supports this. And finally, as Jason said, Joe locked the Petrosian and Oparum release branches so that they test only with Ruby 3.0 in both the UI Classic repo as well as the Decorators repo. So that's 4 additional PRs to our account. And that's it on the UI side. On to Adam.
Thank you. So this sprint in core, the AutoSD team added service resource attachment collection to the core persister. They're using this so that they're able to give more info about the type of storage and be able to do that in a way that's consistent with the existing physical storage using asset details. They also added the basic CRUD operations to the storage services endpoint. So the stub, create, update, and delete methods were added to the core storage service class. For Amazon, the bot updated the list of AWS instance types automatically again. And AutoSD team added a default mode option to the volume create. There's a radio button that lets you pick basic or advanced, and previously there was no default selected. So now they added a default. So basic is automatically selected when you open the form. They also added a post refresh action to be able to connect events that were caught before the physical storage record is saved. This is something that we had done previously with VMs, but they were noticing that they were having some events come in that were not linked to their physical storage. And so we went down that path, and they were able to get that working for their physical storage class as well. And they're now passing the list of storage service capabilities in when creating the volume in an advanced mode, which is when it's automatically creating a new storage service for the volume. Next slide. For VMware, we fixed an argument format issue when scanning via host. This was something that was missed when doing a bunch of changes to allow us to support additional options to the MIQ Vim initializer, and we just missed this one caller. So we got that fixed up. That was reported by a community user. And Keenan removed host discovery from the VMware provider as part of a larger effort to clean up the host discovery code that's no longer used. And next slide, over to Joe.
Okay, for platform enhancements, there were several release management style pull requests around cleanup and on the Oparin branch, and then cutting the new Petrosian branch. Next, Brandon added support to read secrets as files rather than environment variables. The bot updated the English message catalog for the latest strings from code. Next, David created several pull requests in the to add diagnostics around requests and tasks, so it's easier to track the many steps involved in the workflows. Brandon and his bot updated various dependencies. And Nassar added network policies in Podify to allow Kafka communication in the future. Next slide. For platform bugs, Jason fixed the performance bug in the event timeline by adding caching for event groups and the event types. Keenan had 3 pull requests fixing bugs and improving interfaces in the areas of RBAC filtering, conditions, and expressions. Johnny 5V in the community fixed an issue where the ManageIQ DB ready script was using a hard-coded user root and would fail if you used a different username. Next, Brandon fixed a bug preventing the manage app secret from finding and managing the secret due to a typo. Jason fixed a gnarly bug where the active support logger broadcast used by our container and journal D logger didn't support keyword arguments and the FUD that ensues with Ruby 3.0, so he fixed that. During testing on appliances, Brandon noticed he was receiving cannot allocate memory errors, so he bumped the default memory for the appliances from 8 to 12 gigs to give us more headroom. Jason fixed an issue where Automation Engine was using YAML load, which wouldn't work with the newer site versions. The solution was to use safe load and with a permitted class. Next, Jason fixed an issue in our simulate queue worker console command to handle multiple invocations. I removed a broken conditional referencing an undefined local variable. It's been several years unused and would break if we tried, so we removed it. Finally, Adam fixed a bug where we printed delivering in the logs before a worker actually took ownership of a queue message. If there was a stale object error, it would never really had the queue item, even though we logged it. On to Keenan with the API.
Cool. So Orgai added some functionality onto storage service, the API for UI support, and so added create, refresh, and delete, which will definitely be used by the AutoSD, but probably some other areas as well. And then I refactored automate domains to in a long-term effort of deleting code to use a consistent pattern for our controllers in the API. On to Jason.
All right. And let me pause this. Adam, are you gonna voice over this?
Yep. So we're looking at coming up with a way to make it simpler for users to do dynamic dialogues without having to use Automate, since Automate is a pretty heavy thing to pick up and learn. There are whole books about it, and so we're looking at ways to replace that with using a more standardized way to call out to things. And so we're looking at using Docker resources, for example, so Docker containers that you could do essentially whatever you wanted in, and a more standardized way of doing state machines, since that's primarily what most people want to use out of Automate, and they would like to be able to call, standard code after that point. So we started looking at the Amazon Steps language, which is used by, or States language, which is used by Amazon AWS Step Functions, as a pure JSON static representation of a state machine. And so because it's a standard format, there are existing plugins for it. So here's a VS Code showing an example of a really simple single state workflow. And so it has a list of states and a starts at, and after that point, you pass in, there are various types. The resource typically would be an AWS Lambda function, but we're overriding that. And here we can see a Docker container listed, and you can pass in things like parameters and credentials to control how things flow through. So this demo is showing a provisioning from the user point of view, provisioning of a simple VM. So if you want to run this again, yep. So the things that you need to do for provisioning, we need to get a list of providers that you can select. And so that's what this does here. You can see we've got our super simple Docker file and a little Ruby script that pulls secrets and API info from the environment, and then calls out to the ManageIQ API client gem to get a list of providers, optionally filtering on the provider type being passed in, and then dumping the values out. Those values get then passed through state output, goes to the next state's input. And so you can see we've got dialog provider there. And then the more complicated provision of a VM, you can see we have multiple states here. We're creating the clone of the VM. We're checking to see the task is complete. If the task is still running, we go through a retry loop. And once it finishes successfully, we go through and power the VM on. So it's a pretty simple power VM type flow. So here you can see an example of the VMware call out. This could have been any provider. I just happen to have a VMware handy, but it could be even providers that we don't support yet. So since this is a VS Code plugin for the Steps language, it has some call outs for all the available types to help you write these automatically. It even checks your workflow file and auto completes the states that you currently have. And so it makes it a lot easier to go through that without making any typos and errors. And then we can also do a visualization which shows the flow. And so you can see we've got our clone template, we have our poll task with the retry loop, and then the power VM and success. So with that, we have the workflows imported here automatically. So I'm going to go through showing how to create a dialog. And this is where you'd normally have to do some of your Automate code when you were doing the dropdowns. And so if we're going to create a dialog for provisioning a VM, we need to give the VM name. And so we're going to do that. And these all translate to inputs to the provision VM workflow that we can use later on during the run of it. So now we're going to call our provider, our list provider, needs to be dynamic. And so this entry point here is where it used to have to be Automate code. And so you can see we have our workflows listed here. And so we've got our list providers. We're going to show refreshing instead of doing it on a init so that you can see it going out and populating based on the run of the workflow file. And once we've got our provider, we now need to pick a source template. And so that's going to be our list templates workflow that we showed earlier. And it's also going to be dynamic, and we're going to pick that list templates workflow right there. And it's going to be required. And one of the handy little things is once we've got that drop down, we can have the list providers kick off other fields. So when the provider list comes back, it'll automatically refresh the other one, the other drop down. So we've got our dialog there. Going to go and create a service catalog item. It's going to be generic. I'm going to give it a name and make sure we display it in the catalog, which always trips me up because I'm not used to it. This is where we're picking our dialog that we've just created. And now we're going to pick, instead of this, we're going to pick our provision VM workflow that we showed. And so all of the results of the dialog are going to be inputs into the provision of VM workflow. So we'll have access to the provider ID that we were selected and the template reference. So as part of this, we added the credentials for the provider as secrets to the workflow. Did this manually in the command line since we don't have a UI to create this, but eventually you would be associating probably authentication records with the workflow that gets created. So you can see the vCenter 5 gets populated and it automatically kicks off the list to fetch the list of templates. And you can see we've got a template there that we're going to use. And so submit goes and kicks off the standard process for doing a service template provisioning, including all of the auto approvals. And the only difference is instead of going to automate to do the provisioning, it kicks over to our provision VM template. So you can see empty folder there, nothing up my sleeve. Auto provisioning works the same way it always does, or usually does. So you can see it's active. So right now it'll be cloning the template over to the VM. Luckily, this template doesn't have any disks, so the clone goes very quickly. You can see the VM got created there, and it's going to be doing a power on once it checks that the task is complete. Impatiently refresh a few times, and it's running now. So it went through that poll step onto the successful flow, and it is now finished. And that is it for the demo.
Awesome work, Adam. Yeah, we have a lot of exciting things coming for this. Obviously, we still need to do UI visualization. And you can see that little diagram on the right. We're sort of envisioning a drag and drop type interface, as well as the JSON interface. So you can see these things in the UI. And then even when it's running, we know what step it's in at any point in time. So we could actually highlight on that graph which step is currently running. If there's any failures, why a step failed. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. Thanks, Adam. And I believe, yeah, that's it for our Sprint 206 review. The next review will be Sprint 207 on March 8th at the usual place and time. And I'd like to thank Adam for the great work and presentation and all of our other presenters today. Thank you to the community for all your help in finding issues and making PRs. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.